All right. Good afternoon, colleagues, and very warm welcome to our TB Think Tank members. Thank you for joining this special edition TB Think Tank webinar on what was a truly historic gathering, the first ever South African TB Vaccines Preparedness Workshop, which took place late in July in Sandton, Johannesburg. For those of you who couldn't attend, our goal today is to bring to you the key insights and outcomes from that meeting. And let me tell you, this wasn't just any other workshop. It was really a deliberate, strategic convening of the entire TB vaccine ecosystem in one room. And I have to admit, the level of participation was inspiring and humbling. To give you as our members a sense of the enormity of this event, we had over 80 of the country's TB vaccine decision makers and top minds in attendance. The diversity was incredible. We had the full spectrum of science, research represented by leaders like Professors Fairlie, Helen Rees, Prof. Willem, Hanekom, two of whom we have as part of our distinguished panel. We had representation from the regulatory pathway embodied by SAPRA's CEO, Dr. Semete. We had the policy advisory arm from the National Advisory Group on Immunizations with representation from Professor Anton Gottberg. We had even our domestic manufacturing capabilities in the form of Dr. Makwane from BioVac and Professor Tablanche from Afrigen. And crucially, we had the voices of civil society and the lived experience from TB Proof, as well as His Royal Highness Prince Zulu. Most significantly, the workshop was flanked by a profound demonstration of political commitment. It was opened by Dr. Sandile Buthelezi, the Director General of Health, and culminated in a powerful address by the Honorable Minister of Health, Dr. Motsoaledi. Both of the workshop days were co-chaired by Deputy DG Mr. Marouane, as well as our TB Think Tank EXCO co-chair, Professor Farid Abdullah. And let us not forget our ever-present Chief Director, Professor Norbert Njeka. The message was clear. South Africa is not waiting for a vaccine to be approved to start planning. We are being proactive. The purpose of that workshop was to start building a cohesive national roadmap so that when a vaccine arrives, we are ready to roll it out without delay. So to help us unpack the conversations, the decisions, and the next steps that emerged from that room, we are really privileged to have with us three key participants who were at the heart of it all. They will share what was discussed and what it means for the future of TB in South Africa. To provide some global and national context, let me introduce Dr. Nkateko Mkhondo. Dr. Mkhondo is a medical doctor and public health specialist, currently serving as the technical officer for TB at the World Health Organization country office. In this role, she supports national TB efforts by generating evidence through research, developing normative guidance, and adapting global best practices to local contexts. Dr. Mkhondo has provided technical leadership in priority TB studies and program reviews across several countries. She brings extensive clinical and public health experience in TB and HIV, with a career spanning the public sector and non-governmental organizations, both locally and internationally. Then, representing the scientific and research perspective, we have Professor Willem Hanekom. Professor Hanekom is the Executive Director of the Africa Health Research Institute in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. He holds a professor position at the University College London and affiliate professor positions at the universities of KwaZulu-Natal, Cape Town, and Washington. Prof. Hanekom has worked in TB vaccine discovery and development for most of his career, including directing the South African TB Vaccine Initiative, SATV, at the University of Cape Town and leading the TB vaccine program at the Gates Foundation. He serves in an advisory capacity on various vaccination-related committees globally and is currently a strategic advisor to the WHO TB Vaccine Accelerator. Also representing the scientific and research perspective, we have Professor Lee Fairlie. She's the Director of Maternal and Child Health at WITS RHI and an Associate Professor in the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of the Witwatersrand. A pediatrician by training, her work focuses on the prevention and treatment of HIV, TB, and other infectious diseases in children, adolescents, and maternal populations, particularly those affected by HIV. She has led over 20 clinical studies, including those funded by NIH, Gates MRI, TB Alliance, and UNITAID. And she co-leads major protocols such as MTN's DELIVER study and the Community-TB M72 TB vaccine trial. Professor Fairlie is involved in national HIV and PMTCT guideline development and is actively involved in 4 WHO working groups, including TB, measles, mumps, rubella, microarray patch, and HIV, hepatitis B and STIs in pregnancy and lactation, as well as the Coalition of Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, or CEPI, for maternal immunization working group. She has authored over 100 peer-reviewed publications. So thank you again to our esteemed panel. I'm going to start off some of the first questions. Firstly, to Dr. Mkhondo from WHO to help us set the scene, get some context. This first of its kind TB vaccine workshop in South Africa was co-convened with WHO co-convened with the National Department of Health. From a global and national policy perspective, can you tell us why this workshop was so urgently needed now, especially when a vaccine is still a few years away?
Thanks, Priya. I hope I'm audible. So that's a question that actually comes up quite often, to say the vaccine is still so far away. Why is all of these discussions, why are all of these discussions happening now? But to answer your question, from both a global and national policy perspective, we really feel that early preparedness is quite key and essential to ensure that we avoid delays that we often see when we implement or try to roll out various interventions. As you know, there are usually several steps that need to take place. And what we are saying, so WHO has a framework for TB vaccine preparedness that gives advice to countries on how to begin with all of this readiness planning. And one of the things that we hope that it will achieve is to ensure that even way before the product is licensed, we have all the elements that we need to have in place, which will really help us ensure that we then have rapid uptake once the vaccine is available. So I think for South Africa, really co-convening this workshop gave us a platform to translate what is in these global recommendations, as well as other global recommendations, to then a country-specific roadmap, which is something that the country will develop. But the workshop really helped us unpack all of these various aspects that will then inform a roadmap that's specific for us as a country to say, how do we ensure that we are ready when the vaccine is here? Whether it is from evidence that we still need, things that we need to have in place for the delivery systems in our health system, whether it's from a manufacturing and a supply chain perspective, or even most importantly, a financing and access perspective. But we really need to have a lot of things in place well in advance so that we don't face delays when the vaccine finally is here. So, I mean, like you said, the workshop brought together various stakeholders, and it really ensured that we are all aligned with regards to these priorities and what needs to be done ahead of time. So I really hope that we would be able to be ready as a country and roll out quickly once the registration is complete. But most importantly, really as soon as possible, start preventing illness due to TB and, of course, deaths and other suboptimal outcomes. Thanks, Priya.
Thanks. I've got two more questions for you, Nkateko, before I move on to Prof Hanekom. So with, Prof Njeka at the helm, South Africa has been, has this history of being an early adopter of new TB tools. So, moving very quickly from policy or from research to policy to implementation. Based on the workshop discussions, what do you think are the top 2 or 3 reasons that you believe South Africa is well positioned to be a leader in TB vaccine introduction?
Okay, well, there are, of course, many, but I will limit it, and not just because I'm patriotic, but I think the country's track record does speak for itself. But I think first and foremost, political commitment. Like you mentioned, I mean, for the Minister of Health to be there for this workshop, as well as DG, it really does put us in a position of an advantage in terms of, from a political perspective, we have that buy-in. And just to say, Priya, even when we engaged the Minister's office and DG's office, we didn't have to do a lot of convincing. The buy-in was already there. They both agreed that this was important and it's a priority for a country. So I think that groundwork is already there, and it puts us in a good position. But also to say that we have really world-class scientific and research institutes, and some of the colleagues are here on the panel, but that really positions us to be a key, I guess a key hub in terms of development and the impact that will arise. Of course, we have a high burden of disease, so we do need the vaccine, but I think that beyond the vaccine rollout, there's a lot of information and evidence that will come from South Africa that will then further help and improve vaccine rollout and future vaccine development. And also just to say that there's really good linkages in the country between the researchers and the Department of Health, which again, I think really is a key strength for the country. And like I said, there are many, but, I'll just, maybe I'll just stop there.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. Okay, last question. The WHO and TB strategy has ambitious 2035 targets. How critical are new TB vaccines to actually reaching these goals? And what did the workshop tell us about the level, well, I think you mentioned this, but of the political commitment to make this happen?
Yeah, so I won't go too much, I guess, into the political commitment because, like I mentioned, that is really there. The buy-in is there, and the minister and even DG are very passionate about helping the country get to a point where we have a vaccine in place for adolescents and adults. But if most colleagues remember, with the NTB strategy, it started in 2015, and already in the strategy we had this diagram that I think most people have seen, and I wish I'd thought of projecting it, but I think we all know what it looks like. But what it showed was the trends of how things would look if we continued business as usual, and we'd just see around about maybe 2% decline in TB. But you know, with additional modeling that WHO did together with other partners, we realized that we would have to, at some point, introduce a new and effective vaccine, of course, with other measures. But with that, that's when we would actually realize this steep decline in TB. So we really feel that a TB vaccine is actually one of the key tools that would help us realize the end TB strategy targets. We've been saying it from the onset of the strategy in 2015, and we keep saying it that we do need to have a vaccine in place. And we've seen it even with other diseases that we've managed to eliminate globally, that a vaccine really is key. And I think Prof. Hanekom will probably talk to this, but, you know, we've been saying even 50%, well, hopefully, ideally 50% efficacy would really help us avert millions of deaths. But even from the discussions of the workshop, we know that with even less of that, with even less efficacy, we would really save many lives. So as a country, we're really struggling to see a decline in mortality. We're doing well with incidence, but mortality is still a challenge. And we really feel that this would be a key tool to help us realize those targets to reduce incidence, mortality, and catastrophic costs due to TB.
Great. So not just doing what we're already doing very well, but, you know, a new tool in our toolbox, so to speak. Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Dr. Mkhondo. We'll move on to Prof. Willem Hanekom. So, Prof, I'll just wait for the spotlight to change. Sorry, just make sure you're on. The science is moving fast. For our audience, what is the single most exciting or promising piece of data or development with TB vaccines that came out of the workshop discussions?
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this. And I agree, the workshop was incredibly useful. I learned an unbelievable amount there. So I thought, if it's okay with you, just to go one step back and to our audience, just introduce where we are with TB vaccines. So I'm going to share just one or two slides.
Please go right ahead. Go right ahead.
Thank you. I'm just going to present one or two slides. So the first one, as seeing that WHO is represented here, I wanted to say that they have guidelines for what vaccines should look like ultimately. How many dosages, how much efficacy, etc. We aim for TB vaccines. And it's important to understand that we have a vaccine that's very good at the moment for infants and children, 80% effective against severe disease, such as TB meningitis or miliary TB, which is spread all over the body, and around about 60% effective against lung TB in children. But it doesn't work in older people, and really the older people are the ones that spread the disease. So as soon as you become an adolescent, you get different kind of TB, and an adult, and you spread the disease. Now, the exciting thing that we heard at the workshop for me, why won't this come up? Anyway, is that even 20% efficacy against an adult and against adult to adolescent disease will have a massive impact. So this is what the modelers tell us, the mathematical modelers in a setting such as South Africa. So we're going to have, although we aim in the WHO preferred product characteristics for 50% efficacy, we can actually get away with much less efficacy. And this is a very kind of vaccine, therefore, that we'd have to communicate to communities and populations out there. We're not looking for the 80-90% efficacy that COVID vaccines gave us. So in the pipeline, then, in terms of new TB vaccines, there's quite a few candidates, a very small pipeline if you compare it to for example, what COVID still has. But at least there's some, and I divide them up like this. So we've got wholesale vaccines, adjuvanted vaccines, viral vector vaccines, and mRNA vaccines. All right. And I'm going to jump right ahead and tell you that there's one vaccine called M72AS01E, which has two proteins of Mycobacterium tuberculosis, an adjuvant that really stimulates the immune system in a very specific direction that is currently in the phase 3 trial, and by far the leading candidates, and by far the majority of this effort, this phase 3 trial effort, is happening within South Africa right now. So I think for me, this is probably the most exciting thing that I've heard. Is that there is that even 20% efficacy will be good enough, and so this gives us some room to work with ultimately in rolling out a vaccine. There are of course many other vaccines also, like we showed like I've showed here. Some are in phase 3. There's some in 2B, and I think it's the fast follower after M72, if one understands the risks and what is known about the other candidates in late phase. Is a vaccine called TB Vac, which is in phase 2B, which is a whole Mycobacterium tuberculosis that is live and attenuated because there are 2 mutations in it, and this vaccine is also in phase 2B. So overall, we need many more candidates ultimately, because if you understand how many people in the world will ultimately need a vaccine, the efforts are ongoing to try and learn that. But it's likely, if you and I look at on the back of an envelope, we can say it's going to be billions of people that need new TB vaccine. So perhaps 1 or 2 is not ultimately going to be enough. So thank you. Back to you, Priya.
Sure. And thanks for showing out that entire pipeline. I think it's really good to see, exactly where we are. Just coming back to the M72 candidate, I remembered one of the points that you raised, more of a concern was the lack of a manufacturing partner for this leading M72 candidate. What are your thoughts on how big of a risk this is to our timelines, and what do you think is the solution? Sorry to put you on the spot, but
yeah, so I think this is a very important issue. So normally it's not just good, and this is why we had this meeting, isn't it? It's not just good enough to focus on making sure the vaccine works and to get to that step, but we have to look at the steps afterwards. And so if you plan for the vaccine to ultimately be delivered, there needs to be enough vaccine around. So the manufacturing aspects of new vaccines or any new product, be it a drug or diagnostic, is critically important ultimately for success. So this vaccine is sponsored by the Gates Medical Research Institute with funding from the Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust to do the phase 3 trial. But the sponsor's responsibility, who has the license for this vaccine now, is to find a commercial partner, because they're not a manufacturing facility, Gates MRI. They have to find a commercial partner who will actually be able to make vaccine at scale, and perhaps the even hundreds of millions of dosages that are ultimately going to be needed in the world if this vaccine is successful. Now, to do that, the manufacturer needs what we call tech transfer. So we know how to make the vaccine, but the people that originally made it need to transfer it to the new company. And that's not a trivial process. That often takes around about 3 years. So now we're in a situation where Gates MRI still does not have a commercial partner. They're working round the clock, they're telling us, on that. But we may have an efficacy signal in 2027 or 2028. And it's already quite late for tech transfer to be in time to have enough vaccine available in 27, 28. So this is an incredibly important issue for us in the TB vaccine world. We're sitting on the edge of our seats, waiting to hear when is this partner going to be there so that the vaccine can be made and be ready for rollout when it's actually needed. And Priya, I think for me, the important thing about this is to look at contingencies. That's why we must make sure that the other vaccines that are being tested be fast-tracked as fast as possible, because it's not always, there is always risk in product development, always such risks such as this one. There may be other risks for other candidates, but that's why we need to also, if we want to ultimately successfully vaccinate the world against TB, we must also support more upstream development of new vaccines. Thank you.
Yeah, great point. So just looking beyond efficacy, you highlighted also, critical gaps at the workshop in terms of our knowledge for key populations. So which populations are you most concerned about where we lack data? And what is the plan to generate that evidence prior to our rollout?
Yeah, so if you would allow me, I'm going to share another slide then. So this is really what the phase 3 trial looks like. So the indication is prevention of disease in quantiferon positive or tuberculins IGRA positive adolescents and adults. So efficacy will be measurable in this population. So 18,000 people enrolled to get 2 doses of M72 and a power of greater than 90%. If we have 110 cases to get to a vaccine efficacy of 55%. So this has been done in these countries. But then there are other populations, and we all know the populations in South Africa that are at risk of TB. Quantiferon negative persons are also at risk of TB, okay? So in South Africa, 40% of our population, adult population, would be quantiferon negative or IGRA negative. And then also, of course, persons living with HIV is the majority of persons in South Africa that get TB. Now, it's important to understand that because of sample size reasons, it's not possible to get to efficacy in these populations. So the sample size would have to be much larger than 18,000. So to compensate for that, a pretty clever design is to just do a safety and immunogenicity study linked to the phase 3 trial in these two populations. And at least those data will be available, and hopefully then once it goes to SAPRA for approval, where there would be what we call a permissive label that would allow use of vaccine beyond just the populations in which it was tested. But the important thing is that, and I agree with this approach. The important thing, though, is that ultimately we have to look at these populations and make sure the vaccines do actually work. And this is where post-licensure studies are going to be critically important. The kind of things that Lee and Priya and Nkateko and others talked about at a meeting on Monday in Johannesburg. These kind of studies will have to be done ultimately. I think everyone on this call who works in TB will also tell you that previous TB is a very high risk factor. It's been very important in South Africa for getting TB again, and those people who have had TB before are excluded from this trial. And this is also, for me, a very important population would ultimately have to be tested after licensure to make sure that the vaccine is safe and would work in those populations. But there are also many other populations that you can think of. I think I've talked now about what I think the major ones are. So the first one I would mention is that people living with HIV that are in this study are people living with controlled HIV. There's more than 2 million people in South Africa with undiagnosed HIV. Or perhaps uncontrolled HIV. There are other populations that Lee can probably speak to much more, like pregnant persons or lactating persons, various specific risk groups, such as people with diabetes, etc. So there are many other populations, and a working group within the South African TB Vaccine Preparedness Consortium, the consortium that met on Monday, is now going to look exactly at how this should be done and prioritize and plan out how we're going to do these studies that ultimately would have to be done if an efficacy signal is shown and if we have products, as I've said, to deliver. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yes, couldn't agree. We need those post-licensure studies. Thank you, Professor Hanekom. I'm going to move on now to Professor Lee Fairlie. Prof, I know you are working on the clinical trial, and as the PI, sorry, let me just again wait for the spotlight. There we go. As a PI for the M72 phase 3 trial here in South Africa, you have this unique front row seat. Beyond the primary efficacy data, what are the key implementation insights you are gathering from this trial in terms of ease of administration, cold chain logistics, community acceptance? What do you think will be absolutely critical for planning a real-world rollout?
Thanks, Priya, and thanks for the opportunity. And just to acknowledge that Willem is the co-national PI for this particular study. But I think, so in terms of ease of administration and cold chain, it's actually fairly simple. So I think people may or may not know that this is an intramuscular vaccine, and it's stored at 2 to 8 degrees. So really not kind of onerous, minus 20 degree storage conditions that, even lower than I think we saw with some of the COVID vaccines, which really do increase the complexity and really make them quite difficult to store. It's a 2-dose vaccine, so it's given a month apart. I think certainly, optimally one would really want a 1-dose vaccine. Obviously, even in the clinical trials, we see that people, fall out of studies very easily. Their lives change. They get a job somewhere else, and it's really difficult for them to come back for that second vaccination. I think that certainly is one of the advantages of MTB Vac, which is in fact a 1-dose vaccine. I think also, given that the adjuvant and the actual vaccine, it's 2 separate vials, and I think everyone's hopeful that will ultimately be combined. But again, that really does add to then the complexity of administration down the line. Sorry, on the 2-dose. So I think there's a lot of interest in actually just, in people who've only had 1 dose of the vaccine. And obviously there are a number of people on the study. And I think we're really hoping that we'll be able to unpack that data as well, to look at what the immunogenicity is like, and obviously then TB incidence in people who've only had 1 vaccination, although that sample size will probably be really too small. In terms of community acceptance, so I guess it's quite difficult to evaluate that from a clinical trial point of view, because people who are enrolled in the clinical trial are already kind of voting with their feet, right? I mean, they're already, they're wanting to actually be part of the study. But I think, certainly all of us in exploring, which populations to approach for recruitment. Obviously, this particular study was really focused on, as Willem has pointed out, IGRA-positive people. So we really had to be quite purposeful in our recruitment. And I think we really learned a lot of lessons from the community in even those approaches, and things like often people, TB may not actually be their primary concern. A lot of people are actually more worried about HIV and HIV testing. And so I think in some of our approaches, we're really going to have to think about how we are going to package vaccine delivery and vaccine services. We also heard a lot that, people, especially, and this came through very strongly from our community advisory board, and I think we heard this from other groups as well, is that, many people don't, even though they may actually have personally been affected by TB in terms of having had, family members or friends diseased and potentially even died of TB. Many people actually don't have a high understanding of TB, which I think it is actually a very complicated pathogen. So that is entirely understandable. But, I think just thinking about as we move to vaccine delivery, ultimately, we really have to spend a lot of time understanding what are the community's needs in terms of even TB education, vaccine education. I think that one of the things we really learned from COVID is that people are scared of vaccines, and unless you get buy-in from everybody, including healthcare workers, who can often be the people who can sort of halt a campaign if they're not invested in it themselves, or they're not buying into the campaign themselves, that's where your issues might arise with actual vaccine delivery and uptake.
Oh, great. Thanks for that. And just looking at your work, it really sits at this intersection between HIV, reproductive health, and TB. I know the workshop highlighted evidence gaps for key groups. Willem mentioned a few, but like pregnant women, people living with HIV, from your perspective, what is the most responsible and ethical pathway to eventually include these vulnerable high-risk populations in a vaccination program, given that, they are often excluded from the initial trials?
Yeah, thanks. So I was fortunate enough to be part of this WHO working group that was really looking at advancing research in pregnant and lactating women, and I co-chaired the vaccine group. And so, in fact, I have shared this with Nolwazi, so it can be circulated. But the call to action from that meeting, and really the framework has just come out, and I think that quite well sort of sets out what our approach needs to be, particularly in thinking about pregnant women. And I think, we're steadily moving towards thinking of pregnant women rather than a vulnerable group as a scientifically complex group, and really, protection through research rather than from research. But obviously it is stepwise. I mean, there's no one who's going to want to immediately give a pregnant woman a new TB vaccine. But I think a lot of what the call to action is really trying to do is to set in motion thoughts around, how do we plan for this? Because, we already know that, say, for M72, we don't actually have DART data available. We don't think that there will be any particular concerns in pregnancy, but obviously now we're sort of in that gap already where there's actually, there's no major plan towards getting data on pregnant women. And so, I think certainly a stepwise approach, I think just to kind of maybe highlight a few points, is that, women who become pregnant on studies, we should really try and collect as much pregnancy data as possible, even if it's beyond, the first 12 months, or when we think is the sort of high risk period, because all of that may contribute in some way to, the safety, but maybe more likely the immunogenicity data. I think really as soon as we have some safety data in pregnancy, to really try then and specifically include pregnant women in these studies, even if it's a sort of smaller sub-study. And then of course the surveillance work, as Willem mentioned, really then becomes critical, because we know that I think there's a lot of discussion about how the campaign ultimately may work if we have a successful vaccine. But there are varying sort of potentials. For example, just mass rollout to quite targeted vaccination. But if obviously women of childbearing potential will be included in these campaigns, and in almost certainly there will be a number of women who are pregnant when they are vaccinated for both doses. Maybe they become pregnant for the second dose, etc. And so, we do need to be looking critically at that data. Maybe just to mention about lactating women, I think generally there should really be no concern from a safety or immunogenicity point of view, particularly with these sort of non-live vaccines, I think. And then certainly for the live vaccines, many of these vaccines are actually being tested in infants. And so if we've got safety data in an infant population, there really shouldn't be a need for additional data in lactating women, but they still get excluded from the clinical trials. So, yeah, I think we're really trying to, it has to be looked at from the beginning, because again, even though it feels like the vaccine is far away, we still, we've lost ground in terms of those populations, particularly. And then as Willem, I think Willem mentioned some of the other important populations that we really do need to focus on.
Yeah. Thank you so much, and thanks for reminding us about that. And just moving back to some of the stark lessons we learned from COVID, just efficacy doesn't always guarantee uptake, and we saw a lot of the impact of social media around the vaccine hesitancy. So, based on your direct experience from recruiting and retaining participants in this trial, what do you think are some of the most effective strategies for building trust and demand for TB vaccines in communities, especially among groups that are typically hard to reach, like young men?
Yeah. No, it's such an important question. And I think that, again, often we sort of start asking these questions down the line, but I think even at a protocol development stage, for some of these vaccine studies, we really do need to get better at involving community and other stakeholders, right at the beginning, while we're actually developing these protocols, because I think a lot of insights can be, it can frame, some of the potential issues that we might face. There are a number of different studies that have actually been done recently, looking at sort of vaccine hesitancy and acceptance, but there is ongoing work, and much of this work is really being done through the consortium that Willem mentioned. But we really do need to get a granular view, from the community about what people's concerns really are, what's going to drive them towards a vaccine or not, what would they like to see in a package. Maybe they don't want to just come, and maybe this particularly relates to men in a way, because I think that often what we find is that actually men are most interested in an HIV test, and so then maybe that has to be part of our kind of package when we're thinking about rolling out. But it probably isn't a one size fits all, and different communities might have different components that they feel are more or less important. I think we really need to consider factors around stigma. I think obviously we recognize that TB to some, and probably a large extent, there are socioeconomic factors which really drive TB disease and morbidity and mortality, but obviously that also may actually feed into stigma around that, and creating this sort of vicious cycle around us not actually being able to get people vaccinated who really are at highest risk of TB disease. And I think we're going to really have to be quite creative. I mean, there really are some fantastic sort of tools that are coming out from AI and chatbots, et cetera, kind of stratifying people's risk. And I think that potentially that's very compelling for people who, may actually not have the time to go to a clinic during sort of normal, regular hours, but might actually want to, chat to a chatbot, understand their risk, understand where they can access vaccines, understand where they can access TB testing, etc. So I think, that I don't think we have all the answers yet, but certainly we are working towards those. And I think there's a lot that we need to consider.
Thank you so much, and I totally agree. The co-creation right up front with the community, I think, is really critical. So before I move on to the more questions for all of you to answer, I just want to remind our members that they're welcome to post any questions they might have to the panel about the workshop or about TB vaccines, please, in the Q&A, and we'll try to ensure that your question is asked and answered. This is something I know I was kind of grappling with a little bit in terms of at what point do we start sensitizing, the greater South African community? Because it almost seems like there needs to be this balance, right? At the moment, there's a few unknowns about the MTB vac, whether it's going to be available, about the efficacy, about where the funds are going to come from. So there is some uncertainty about what the plan is. But at the same time, is it too early to start sensitizing the community that this is something we are engaging with? Or do we start a social media campaign almost, from now? So I just like to, maybe since Lee, you're on, but get all the other, panel members on as well, just to see what is your take. Is it too early to start sensitizing the bigger, broader community, given, a whole host of unknowns, and then risk losing, the credibility with them if some of the things that we're saying up front doesn't necessarily, come to fruition? Or, I know I'm probably not articulating it clearly, but just help me understand, what is your sense of, is it too early to start with the social mobilization or the communication as a whole around TB vaccines? I don't know if, Lee, you're happy to go first?
Yeah, that's fine. So, I think it is a really important question. And, really, as you highlight, it really is a balance, because you don't want to be kind of over promising a vaccine, but you also don't, we do need to make progress in terms of TB education around vaccines, etc. And so perhaps it's a staged approach, and also we do have TB prevention tools, so perhaps it's sort of framing the package as an evolving package of TB prevention, rather than over focusing on one vaccine or two vaccines, because I think while we are extremely hopeful that that we will be able to replicate efficacy, I think nobody sort of, we can't, we unfortunately don't have that wonderful crystal ball that I think we all wish that we did. But yeah, so I would just say, there is a lot that we can already offer people. And I think it's actually sensitizing people around TB, around what is already available, and really kind of understanding, what are communities' perspectives, what are the things that actually, would be important to them in terms of knowing about TB and TB prevention.
Yeah, I like that, focusing on the full kind of package. Anything to add, Nkateko, Willem?
Maybe I can add a little bit to what Lee was saying. I really think that one thing that we don't do so well, I think, in public health is getting ahead of things and really informing the public around some of our messaging well in advance. And what then tends to happen is that we lose some form of control over that narrative. There are other people then who are talking to this topic who may not be sharing what is true, may not be sharing what is accurate, maybe even creating some form of hesitancy among the public. So I agree with that. We need to start talking to it. Maybe not in absolute detail, but it's something that we need to start talking to. And I think a few of us were participated in some radio interviews alongside the workshop. And I remember in one of the interviews that I participated in, people were actually interested to say, okay, what is this thing that's coming? And if we are not sharing that information, then you'll have other people who are not maybe for the vaccine or who are not well placed to be sharing that information, going ahead and doing that. So I agree. We have a package of interventions. We have great TB preventive medicine. We can be sharing about the TB vaccine as part of that. But just to say that we need to get ahead of the messaging and already start, dropping just some of those little, just a bit of information and really educating the public around what the TB vaccine is, what's happening in South Africa. We're part of the trials and just, educating them about it. And I think we'd be surprised, but I think it would actually help people have more confidence knowing that, it's not something that came out of the blue like we heard with COVID, but, or at least that's how people felt, but that it's been worked on over some time. South Africa has been a part of it. Our researchers have been a part of it. And yeah, we can have some trust in it. So I do think that it's important for us to start talking about it early on. Thanks.
Thanks, Nkateko. Willem, anything?
Yeah, I agree 100% with what Nkateko's just said. I think there's interest. I think we are very scared of the extreme anti-vaxxers and these things that happen that in the vaccine space. But the majority of people are really interested and actually would want to know about what is going on. And I think we should, as Nkateko said, we shouldn't underestimate the engagement that we can actually have and that people can give us very valuable feedback. Perhaps the only thing that I would add is like, in the co-creation of the messaging, we really have to get experts involved. Perhaps the four of us that are on this panel are not the experts. We need to get the real communication experts engaged to tell us how to do it and not presume that we know how to do it. Thank you.
Yeah, no, excellent point. So my next question, Willem, I'm going to have you start since you're the last one on that one. This workshop, it brought together groups of people that don't always sit at the same table. Scientists, regulators, manufacturers, community advocates. What was your impression of their willingness to collaborate as well as they drive or kind of interest in TB vaccines and the rollout?
I thought there was extraordinary interest, but I must say it was a selected group of people. These were all people that were interested in TB, but they were very interested in talking, like we heard earlier in this panel, very interested in engaging. And I think the real challenge is for us, what do we do from here? There are many stakeholders, like you just said, Priya, in this space. WHO, Department of Health, academics, civil society, persons with lived experience, many kinds of stakeholders, and I think that what is emerging is that the South African Novel TB Vaccine Preparedness Consortium, which is led by Dimakatso Lebina, who is on this call also, and many people in the TB implementation space know. So that consortium and maybe an ideal vehicle to bring people together and to actually talk, you know, in a way that we don't, that there's very little overlap with activities, and rather much more synergy. But there's certainly an incredible amount of interest out there. Thank you.
Priya, you're mute.
Thanks. Sorry, Lee. I was just saying, anything that you want to add about the engagement of, you know, this very diverse group?
No, I mean, I think just to echo what Willem said, it really was wonderful to see so much enthusiasm for preparation, you know, for ultimately the TB vaccine. And you know, yeah, it was just very reassuring to think that people, you know, everyone was thinking so far ahead, obviously not kind of racing ahead, but, you know, making sure that each step is being considered, and that we can really hopefully optimize rollout when this vaccine becomes available.
Okay. Nkateko, anything from you?
I think the colleagues covered everything well, Priya. Maybe just to say that, you know, we say WHO and NDOH co-convened the workshop, but obviously with immense support from the Aurum Institute. And I really think that this webinar is timely. I'm glad that we are continuing the discussions. And maybe from my end, just to say that I hope that these discussions then continue and we don't lose this momentum, especially with the vaccines being a little bit far out. That is a risk that we run. But I really hope that we can keep these conversations going among the various stakeholders so that we ensure that the work continues. Thanks.
You know, fantastic. I mean, I loved Willem's slides. We look like we might have him on another webinar just exclusively talking about TB vaccines, Willem. So I'm pinging you in advance. I know we don't have much time left. I'm not sure. I'm not really seeing any questions from, I hope our team has access or the members have access to the Q&A. But I do want to cover, you know, the so what about the workshop, and particularly for our members who are also very much interested in TB as part of the TB think tank. You know, beyond the report that's going to come out, as well as the roadmap, what is the one concrete, tangible outcome, you know, that specifically, what is the one tangible outcome that has already happened as a direct result of this workshop? So is there any specific working groups that we're looking to formalize or plan to formalize, or critical conversations between, you know, different agencies? What is the one concrete kind of tangible outcome do you think this has? Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, I think incredible outcomes already. So the first is that this will be reported by you, Priya, with input from many of us. So that's important. So communication about what the issues are, etc., is extremely important. The second is that there's already effort ongoing, led by Nkateko and others, to develop a roadmap for how to roll out vaccines in South Africa specifically. In the WHO has generated such a document that's sort of generic for the whole world about how to roll out such vaccines, but we're working on this actively. The third is this phenomenal consortium that we're all part of, that now has 2 working groups already, and the one looking at the studies that have to happen post-licensure, and the other looking at civil society and community engagement in these processes and how we can do this optimally. In addition, this consortium is also already funded to look at very specific implementation questions surrounding new TB vaccine. So I think there's been phenomenal outcomes. I think for me, the most important outcome, and I'm going to sound like an old gramophone to people on this call and know me, but the most important outcome for me of the whole effort would be that the vaccine should be rolled out within 2 years of the efficacy signal being there. There are many examples of malaria vaccines and other vaccines where it's taken years and years and years, and this is why the work has to be done now. 2 years, that's the absolute deadline. We have to have the vaccine rolled out to start saving lives and decreasing morbidity. Thank you.
Thanks. And I think you're going to have all of us singing the same tune about the 2 years, within 2 years. Thanks, Willem, for that response. But, in addition, I was trying to get to, for our membership and the audience that are full of TB professionals who weren't in the room, what is the one key takeaway or action item from this workshop that you think our members here today should be aware of to advocate for, or to start preparing, or just to be a little bit more active in the TB vaccine space? Lee, anything from your side? I know Willem mentioned the South African Novel TB Vaccines Preparedness Consortium. From your side?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it, I think Willem has raised all of those points, which are really important. I think maybe just to kind of raise, on an operational level, I mean, I think it really, and obviously this will feed into the roadmap, but I think, often it quite far down the line, we sort of engage with the real sort of operational implementation issues, and certainly not to say that those are sorted out, but then definitely there are a number of different projects that are going to be looking at this. So, where is going to be the optimal place for vaccine delivery, for, what sort of campaigns need to be run, which departmental program needs to be running these, and is there sufficient capacity? And I think those are real issues that have, if they're not thought through early enough, they really do have the potential to actually derail such a program. So I think, those really granular components that actually need to be in place well before vaccines are delivered. And that's certainly something that people can start to think about, even within their own clinics or in their own practices.
Thanks, Lee. Nkateko?
Thanks, Priya. Absolutely agree with Lee. I think for me, it's just around ensuring that our systems are ready. And I think for the people on the call, that's a low-hanging fruit. That's something that we can all really have an input on. And personally, for me, it's an area that I'm very passionate about, because I do feel like we need to ensure that we're working on that well ahead of time, so that by the time the vaccine time comes, we're not scrambling and trying to, those are things that take a long time to really improve and get to an optimal place where we want them. And when I talk about systems readiness, I'm not talking just about the actual service delivery from the vaccine side of things or the EPI side of things, but even around the data systems, around issues of community mobilization. Currently, we have various outbreaks of measles and other vaccine preventable diseases. And I think now it's the time to really strengthen all of those aspects in preparation for the vaccine. Thanks.
Thanks so much. I know we've come to the end of our hour. I just want to thank our brilliant panelists for sharing, these critical insights. It's clear that, the workshop wasn't just a talking shop, but a decisive step towards a tangible plan. The message seems to be one of cautious optimism. The vaccine is coming, but our success depends on the work we do now, on the evidence, systems, financing, and community trust. Any last words from our panel?
I think it's all been
Willem?
said, but thank you very much for this opportunity.
Great. Lee, good?
Yep, I agree. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you again sincerely to the distinguished panel and to our members for joining us today to learn how South Africa is actively preparing for a novel TB vaccine. Please watch your inbox for future communication from the TB think tank. And with that, I conclude this. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.